Good morning. I know it's bright and early for all of us, but I would love to welcome you this morning to the Salvation Army Executive Leadership Breakfast. I'm glad your alarm went off and that we're all here today and bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and ready for this morning. But I'd like to thank the Salvation Army DFW Metroplex Command and the DFW Board for all your generosity for hosting us today. We are honored to have such strong support in the DFW community, and we appreciate all of you who are committed to helping the Salvation Army help those in need in our communities. As chairwoman of the National Advisory Board, I have the privilege of traveling around the country and visiting different cities and meeting with their community leaders and business leaders and seeing the great work that the Army's doing in other communities. And I'll also get the opportunity to share with them our story about how our family in the Dallas Cowboys got involved with the Salvation Army. But today, it's a little bit unusual for me, as rarely do I find myself sharing the podium with my father, talking about the same subject. And I'm not exactly worried about taking his speaking points, because I've never really heard him at a loss for words. But today, I get to go first, so I'm going to share the story, and he'll just have to play option quarterback later. But over 15 years ago, our relationship began with the Salvation Army. And that was in the mid to late 90s, and as many of you recall, the Dallas Cowboys were on a heyday. We had just won the last 3 out of 4 Super Bowls, and we were at the height of our visibility. Every television station, newspaper, radio, every headline was talking about the Dallas Cowboys. And it was great. And then one day, one of our players made an unfortunate decision off the field, and everything changed overnight. And as we sat around our breakfast table with my parents, my mom and my dad, looking at the headlines, my father said, "What are we going to do about this?" And he said, "You know," my dad, always the eternal optimist, he said, "We need to take all this visibility and all this interest in the Dallas Cowboys and use it to turn the spotlight onto an organization that is truly doing good in our community." And he said, "You know what? We need to be the Jerry Lewis of something." He said, "Now, we need to go out and find an organization that has a brand that has a national, if not international, scope. And we need to find a brand that is as strong, if not stronger, than our own. But most importantly, we need to find a charity that's built on integrity, because they need to be able to stand up to this media scrutiny and be able to shine through in the toughest of times." And in typical Jerry fashion, he said, "Now go find them." So a few weeks later, I found myself attending a board meeting for another charity that my father served on, and it was at the headquarters of Frito-Lay. And as I walked in and sat down in this meeting, in walked Steve Reineman, who at the time was the president of Frito-Lay. And as the meeting began, he welcomed everybody and exchanged a few pleasantries, but he couldn't stay for the meeting. But before he left, he slid me a note and he walked out. And I had never met Mr. Reineman before, so it was pretty exciting actually being in his building to begin with as a young marketing executive. But to get a note from him, before the meeting ended was even more so. And I opened the note and it simply said, "Please see me in my office when the meeting adjourns." So I sat there through the meeting, and of course the only thing I could think of is, what does he want to talk to me about? And in the back of my mind, I worked for one of our great salesmen, and he had always been trying to get a meeting with Mr. Reineman to sell him a suite or tickets, and I'm thinking, maybe if I could go land a deal in here, that it would really be great. But as I got off the elevator, I walked into his office and I sat down, and the first thing he said was, "Do you know what organization helps more children than any other in our country?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Do you know what the largest service organization in the world is?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, let me ask you this." He said, "Do you know what the Salvation Army does?" And I looked at him and I said, "It's a place where I take my old clothes." Well, that wasn't really the right answer. But Steve Reineman said, "That is exactly our problem." He said, "The Salvation Army, with its greatest asset, its humility, is often its biggest challenge." He said, "They don't go around patting themselves on the back and talking about all the great things that they do." He said, "We need somebody to do it for them." We need somebody to tell our story and to get the word out about the Salvation Army. And he said, and I think you can help us. And as we sat there and visited, and he told me more and more about the Salvation Army, I told him, well, you know, we could always use a halftime of one of our games. And he explained to me that the biggest time for the Salvation Army is in the holiday season with the red kettles. And I said, well, why don't we take our halftime, and we just happen to have one of the greatest games and most highly visible games as Thanksgiving Day every year right here at Texas Stadium. I said, why don't we launch that Red Kettle campaign at halftime? And on that day, sitting in his office, the idea of the National Red Kettle Campaign kickoff was born, and so was our passion for the Salvation Army. You know, perhaps the greatest responsibility that we have with the Dallas Cowboys is what we can do to help those in need. We know that people don't stand in line and buy tickets to see grace and mercy. We know they don't fill the stands and cheer for acts of compassion, because compassion is not a spectator sport. Everyone has to play. You know, our head coach, Jason Garrett, told us at the beginning of the season last year when he was addressing our team and our organization, and he was talking about the importance of integrity and character. And he said, the purpose of life is to live a purposeful life. Well, I believe the Salvation Army embodies that. The men and women in this room and around this country in uniform are working day in and day out to provide services to families in need. Whether it's the unexpected disasters, the tornadoes that blew through here this past month, or the everyday disaster that people find themselves in, the Salvation Army is here to provide hope for the homeless, hope for the hopeless, shelter for the homeless, and food for the needy. As many of you know, the poverty rate in our country is at an all-time high. Right here in our own community, 1 in every 4 children live below the poverty line. So what can we do to help? Well, we can help the Salvation Army. And we can help the Salvation Army by helping them spread the word. So I ask you today, after you've heard all of this exciting information and the videos and the people that are about to speak before you, that when you leave here, that you go tell somebody about the Salvation Army. Tell your coworkers, your friends, your spouse, but probably most importantly, your children. Tell them about the Salvation Army. And this is what you tell them. They are an army, fighting on the front lines on our war on poverty. They are humble stewards of other people's generosity. They feed empty stomachs and hungry souls. They are the Salvation Army, and they are doing the most good. But don't just take my word for it. Let's hear from Paul. He is one of over 100,000 individuals that the Salvation Army has helped here in our community this year alone. Let's listen to Paul.